Thank you very much for that incredibly warm welcome. There are many different things I'd like to talk about today. Say a little bit about my book, 0 to 1, which is a book in which I try to explain everything that I've learned over the years about starting companies, startups, technology, and business more generally. And it's always a bit of a challenge to write a book about entrepreneurship or to teach about entrepreneurship because it is not a science. There is no science. There's no formula where if you follow these 7 steps, you will make $1 million or you will have a successful company. And everybody is always looking for a formula. And the problem is that the next Mark Zuckerberg will not start a social networking site. The next Larry Page will not start a search engine. The next Bill Gates will not start an operating system company. And so if you are copying these people, you're in some sense not learning from them at all. And so what I try to do is approach this question indirectly, because the critical thing is to do something new that's never been done before. And the indirect questions are things like, what is a good business nobody has started yet? Or the more intellectual version of this question, which I think always makes for a fantastic interview question to ask people, is tell me something that's true that almost nobody agrees with you on. And this turns out to be a very hard question for people to answer. And it's hard because we always think you have to be really brilliant to come up with an answer. But I think many of us actually do have answers to this question, but we're embarrassed, we're uncomfortable to tell the answers to the person asking the question, because a good answer is one the person asking the question will disagree on. So if you say something like, our political system is screwed up, our educational system does not work, everybody already agrees with these answers. Those are not interesting or good answers. The good answers are ones that people will not want to hear. And I think we live in a world in which courage is in far shorter supply than genius. So what I'd like to do in my comments today is give a few of my answers to this question, things that I believe to be true that most people do not agree with me on, and then get people thinking about looking at the world in slightly different ways. We are always taught to compete, that if you want to succeed, you need to compete. And my single overarching idea is that if you really want to succeed, you need to figure out how not to compete. That people mistakenly think that capitalism and competition are somehow synonyms. I think they are antonyms. A capitalist is someone who is in the business of accumulating capital because they're doing something nobody else is doing. They're offering a product nobody else is selling, so they can charge a good price for it. If you are in a world of perfect competition, you will make no profits. The profits will be all competed away. So if you want to compete like crazy, you should open a restaurant. And this is always my example for a terrible business. You'll have ferocious competition. You'll probably go out of business. Even if you do not go out of business, you will not do terribly well. And then a great company is always is what I call a monopoly. It's something where there's no competition at all. The example I give in my book of a great company is Google, where they've had very little competition in search for the last 12, 13 years, at least in the US and Western Europe. Korea is maybe a little bit different. And as a result, it's been making enormous amounts of profits for many years now. And I think this monopoly versus competition idea is the single most important business idea that people do not understand. And they don't understand it for a few different reasons. One is somewhat intellectual, because the companies that have monopolies never talk about it. So if you're running Google, if you're the CEO of Google, you will not go on TV and say, we have a fantastic monopoly. Because when you say that, the government will come after you very, very quickly. And so you will instead pretend that there's enormous amounts of competition and that you are not a search engine, but you are a technology company, which is much, much bigger than search. And so you are competing with the Android phones, with Apple, and you're competing with Facebook and Amazon, and you're building a self-driving car, so you're going to be competing with all the car companies in the world, and there's competition everywhere, and no, this is not the monopoly the government's looking for. So the people who actually have monopolies rarely talk about it, and it's always somewhat of a hidden truth as a result. And then on the other hand, if you're competing like crazy, you will also tend to want to downplay that a little bit too. So if you were to leave today's show and say, well, I'm not going to listen to anything Peter said, I'm just going to open that restaurant, as I'd always been planning to, you'd very quickly run into, nobody would want to give you money, it would be hard to get investors, and the basic challenge would be that, and you try to come with some fictional story how you're not competing, but the reality is it's just a restaurant and it's competition like crazy. So I think this truth gets obscured by everybody involved, and as a result is very poorly understood. And that's sort of the intellectual reason people don't understand the importance of monopoly. But there's also, I think, a somewhat more psychological reason that goes maybe a little bit deeper, which is that we're all somehow addicted to competition. We find competition incredibly validating psychologically. And I was very, very guilty of this when I was growing up in Northern California as a teenager and into my 20s, where it was sort of everything was tracked into one crazy competition after another. I remember my 8th grade junior high school yearbook. One of my friends wrote in, Peter, I know you're going to go to Stanford University in 4 years. 4 years later, I got into Stanford. I went to Stanford, and you sort of get in. You have another round in the tournament. Then I got into law school, which is a graduate school in the U.S. I got into Stanford Law School, and then I ended up at sort of a very prestigious law firm in New York City. And I never really asked why I was doing any of these things. It was just every time it was just you had to beat the people around you. You had to compete and beat people. And then it was this very strange place where on the inside, from the outside, it was a place everybody wanted to get in. On the inside, it was a place everybody wanted to get out. When I left after 7 months and 3 days, one of the people down the hall from me said they had no idea it was possible to escape from Alcatraz. They thought the firm was like a prison you could never get out of. But of course, all you had to do was go out the front door and not come back. But this was psychologically very hard for people to do because their whole sense of self-worth, their identity, everything they thought about themselves was wrapped up in all these competitions they had won over many, many years. The opening sentence in Anna Karenina, the Russian novel, is all happy families are alike, all unhappy families are unhappy in their own special way. And I think the opposite is true of business. I think that all happy companies are different because they found something unique to do. All unhappy companies are alike because they somehow failed to escape the essential sameness that is competition. When the chapter in my book entitled All Happy Companies Are Different was excerpted by the Wall Street Journal, they get to give it a different title. And they thought they needed a punchier title that had was a little bit edgier. And they changed the title from All Happy Companies Are Different to Competition is for Losers, which is very counterintuitive because we always think of the losers as the people who are not good enough at competing. The losers are the people whose grades are not quite good enough on the test scores, who are a little bit too slow on the athletic team. And we never think of the loser as perhaps the losers as people who are addicted so badly to competition, who are so obsessed with the people around them that they lose sight of anything transcendent, anything important, valuable, meaningful in the process. And I think that this sort of afflicts people on many, many different levels in many different forms. Henry Kissinger once described his fellow professors at Harvard, was talking about his fellow professors at Harvard University, and said, the battles in academia are so ferocious because the stakes are so small, which always seems like a definition of absolute insanity. Why would you fight like crazy over nothing at all? And on one level, it is an absolutely insane situation. On another level, it's just a logic of a certain situation where the logic is that if you can't differentiate yourself from the other person, the stakes get very small. If you're fighting like crazy, if you want it no matter what, you don't have to get paid very much. And so it's both insane and the deep logic of a certain situation. You know, there's this strange phenomenon in Silicon Valley where many of the people who've been successful entrepreneurs seem to be suffering from a mild form of Asperger's or something like that. They seem to be socially a little bit maladapted in one way or another. And I think we need to always take this fact and turn it around into a critique of our whole society. We need to ask the question, why is anybody who's normal, anybody who's not suffering from Asperger's at a disadvantage, where your original ideas, your interesting thoughts, you'll be talked out of exploring them before they're even fully formed, because you will pick up on all these social cues from people around you, and it'll be, oh, that's a little bit too strange, that's too weird, no, you probably shouldn't do that, probably just safest to go back and open that restaurant like everybody else. And I think this is something that's very deep in human nature. Already in the time of Shakespeare, the word ape meant both primate and to imitate. And there is something about human nature where imitation is a very deep aspect of what we do. It's how we learn language as children, by copying our parents. It's how culture is transmitted in our society. But it also leads to many forms of insane behavior. It leads to crazy peer pressures when we're young. It leads to the madness of crowds. It leads to, ape-like, sheep-like, lemming-like, herd-like behavior. It leads to market bubbles and all sorts of forms of insanity. And I've often thought that that the anti-Asperger group, if you say, what are people who are the anti-Aspergers, I often think those are like business school students, where these are people who are super extroverted, they're socially very well adapted, they have very few convictions typically, so they're a little bit low on the conviction side. In the US, when you have an MBA program, you take all these people and you put them in the same place for 2 years, and they talk to one another for 2 years to try to figure out what they're going to do next, which is kind of a difficult thing since nobody has any idea what to do next, since they're all there because they don't know what to do next. And then they've done these studies at Harvard Business School where they found that the largest cohort from every class does the precisely wrong thing. It's like they're all trying to catch the last wave. In 1989, the largest group wanted to work for Michael Milken, who was involved in all the junk bonds in the 80s. It was 1 or 2 years later, he went to jail. They were never interested in technology, except for 99, 2000, when they descended on Silicon Valley, just as the dot-com bubble was about to come to an end. And so it's sort of the systematic bias to do all the precisely wrong things. And it's easy to make fun of business school students. I think we have to realize that we're all subject to these pressures to a tremendous degree. When we look at advertising on television, people often think to themselves, look at that stupid ad. Who are the dumb people who fall for that? And the very disturbing truth is that it is all of us. We're all incredibly prone to these kinds of things. We're incredibly subject to this. Now, there are sort of a number of implications for business of this monopoly idea when you sort of try to apply it in founding a company and investing or picking the right company to join. And one sort of very counterintuitive idea is we're often told in business that you should go after very big markets. But what I think you always want to go after is a large market share, because that's a monopoly, is you have a large percent share of the market. And so when you start a new company, you're starting small, so you want to start with very small markets so you can quickly get to a big share. When PayPal started, payments is a huge, huge space, but we went after a very narrow problem of eBay power sellers, about 20,000 merchants on eBay, no obvious solution. We had a much better solution than anything else they could do, and you went from 0 to 35% market share in 3 months. That was a very auspicious start. Facebook started with 12,000 people at Harvard University. It was such a small market that if you'd written this up as a business plan, nobody would have invested. They would have said the market's way too small. And you went from 0 to 60% market share in 10 days. Again, a very, very promising start. And then you sort of grew in concentric circles and scaled it from there. One of the questions I often get asked are, what are some trends that I see in technology? Where do I see things going in the years ahead? And I always dislike answering this question because I'm not a prophet. I can't foretell what is going to happen. Or I can give sort of very banal answers. I can say things like, there will be more cell phones used in 5 years or something, but that's not very interesting. It doesn't actually help in any way. But one thing that I would suggest is that almost every trend that people talk about, I believe, is overrated, exaggerated, and should be highly questioned. And so in Silicon Valley, there's a trend around healthcare IT software and education software. These are overrated. There is a very strong trend around SaaS, enterprise software, extremely overrated. If you hear the words big data, cloud computing, you need to run away as fast as possible. You need to just think this is fraud and just run away. And the reason you should be scared of buzzwords is that the buzzwords, they are like a tell in poker. They're an indication that you're bluffing and that there's no real business and that it's not differentiated, because the buzzword tells you that you're doing something in a category in which many other people are already doing it. The category is well understood because it's often been discussed by different people. And so if you are the 20th or the 100th company in a given category, people will very easily understand the category, but it's a symptom of things somehow being very off. And so if you have like a whole concatenation of these buzzwords, so we're building a mobile platform for SaaS software in the cloud using big data. That's sort of like an indication that something's very, very amiss, very off, because you never want to be, you don't want to be the 4th online pet food company, the 10th thin film solar panel company, the 5,000th restaurant in Seoul, Korea. This is always the sort of thing that one needs to resist. I think the really great companies, the ones that are underrated, are often the ones that don't fit into any categories at all. And we do not even have the language, we don't even have the words to describe what people are doing. And so it's often a tremendous challenge, even for the people founding these companies, to explain what it is they're doing. And they tend to be somehow very underestimated, certainly by the investors and by the rest of the world, and then they gradually scale. And there are, of course, many subtle nuances to this. Sometimes you have categories where things are mislabeled within a category. So in the late 90s, Google described itself as a search engine, and people could have said, well, there are already so many search engines. It's just another one, this category that already exists. But I would argue that was actually been the wrong category. Google was not a search engine. It was a computer-powered search, very different from human-powered search. With the PageRank algorithm, it was something fundamentally different. So if you labeled it a search engine, you would have lost sight of what was unique, what was essential, what was valuable. Facebook always gets characterized as a social networking site. One of my friends, Reid Hoffman, who ended up starting LinkedIn years later, back in 1997, started a company called SocialNet. So they had social networking in the name of the company 7 years before Facebook, in 1997. And they had all these theories on how to do it. It was going to be in cyberspace, and you'd have these fake alternate persona, and maybe one person would be a cat and one person would be a dog, and you'd have to figure out how the two of you would interact in cyberspace. And this turned out not to be what people were interested in at all. They were not interested in fictional alternate persona. They were interested in real identity. And real identity was the problem that needed to be solved. Facebook was the first company to crack real identity, whereas networking in the abstract, not that interesting. You don't really want to spend all your time networking with cats and dogs or something like that. And so I think these are all these sorts of perspectives that one comes to in thinking through this in really rethinking this competition idea. I want to maybe close by offering one other sort of slightly contrarian thought on a somewhat bigger picture scale. I think that if the 21st century is going to be a successful century, it will involve both globalization and technology. And I always think of these two things as very different kinds of things. The words often get used almost interchangeably, but I think they're very different. I think of globalization I draw it on the x-axis. It is copying things that work. It's going from 1 to n. It's horizontal or extensive growth. And I think of technology, I draw that on the y-axis. It's doing new things. It's going from 0 to 1. It's intensive or vertical progress. So, globalization is going from 1 to 100 typewriters. Technology is going from a typewriter to a word processor. And, there's obviously room for some of both in our world. But it's worth reflecting that in the last 200 years, there have been periods of globalization and periods of technology, and they do not precisely overlap. I think 19th century, you had a lot of both globalization, where the world became much more connected, and a lot of technological progress. But after 1914, start of World War I, the world becomes much more divided. There's less trade, parts of the world become communist, and so you end up with globalization goes very much in reverse starting in 1914, but technology continues on many, many fronts for many decades. And then in recent decades, and I would date this to the Kissinger trip to China in 1971, globalization starts again, and we've had a ferocious amount of globalization the last 40 years. But I would argue that we've had more limited technological progress. And in fact, the word technology now means only information technology. It means, first semiconductors, then computers, internet, mobile internet. Whereas in the 1950s and 1960s, technology meant many other things. It meant spaceships and supersonic airplanes. It meant new forms of energy. It meant underwater cities. It meant new forms of agriculture, the Green Revolution in agriculture. It meant new materials, new pharmaceuticals, new medical devices. And so there has been, and while I think the computer revolution has been quite strong, there are many other areas where I think we've had more limited progress. And so the 19th century was a period of both globalization and technology. The 20th century, first part, 1914 to 71 approximately, globalization goes in reverse, but you still have a lot of technology. And then the more recent part, the last 40 or so years, a lot of globalization, but more limited progress on technology. And I think this is in part reflected in our culture, US and Western Europe especially, which is, I think at this point, completely opposed to science and technology. And even though we always say that we're in favor of it, I think the reality is that our culture dislikes science and dislikes technology very intensely. And the easiest way to see this is to look at all the science fiction films that come out of Hollywood. And they show technology that doesn't work, that kills people, that destroys the world, that is dystopian, and it's one technologically bad thing after another. And the future is some combination of the movies Avatar or Elysium or The Matrix or maybe the Terminator movie with robots running around killing people. I watched the Gravity movie the other day, which was you have sort of the space station, outer space. Everything goes wrong. You would never want to go into outer space. You are really happy to be back on the muddy tropical island somewhere. And of course, I'm not blaming Hollywood here, because I think it just reflects the broader culture for the most part. And it's just an indication of how the broader culture doesn't want science or technology. And that's why I think the real counterculture in our society today, in the Western world, in the developed world today, is the part that's pushing science and technology, because most of our culture, most of our society actually wants to see things not change or hold things back. If you frame this idea in geopolitical terms, in the 1950s and 1960s, you would have divided the world into the first world and the third world. First world was that part of the world which was technologically progressing. The third world was sort of permanently screwed up. Today, you would divide the world into the developed and the developing countries. And so this is a dichotomy that is very pro-globalization. The developing countries are those countries that are copying the developed countries, and they're all sort of converging. The world's becoming more and more homogenous. It's all sort of becoming the same as you have this convergence, pro-globalization story that runs through it. But it's also the case that this way of talking about our world is implicitly anti-technological, because when we say that we live in the developed world, then we are saying that those of us in the United States or Western Europe or South Korea, we're saying that we're living in that part of the world that's done, finished, where nothing new is really going to happen. It is, after all, fully developed, and where the younger generation should have reduced expectations for the future from their parents and their grandparents. And I think this is a conception of our society that we should resist very powerfully. And so I will end by asking the contrarian question that I think needs to be asked far more often. How can we go about developing our so-called developed world? Thank you very much.